Okay, I wanted to show you guys how I'm grading your paragraphs because some of us will be coming to remediation uh, and fixing things, and knowing exactly how I'm grading may help you get out of remediation. And then for some of you that won't be coming to remediation, this will still help because I'll always grade paragraphs like this in the future. Now, today, all I'm focusing on is, did you write a clear topic sentence, RDF sentence, and two clear E sentences, specifically an E sentence with a quote and an E sentence with an explanation or a justification? And I've taken an example from one of my classes and put it up here. I've not even read it. I know the student, and the student is a strong student, so I expect it to be pretty good, but I've not read it yet. So here we go. Here's the process. It says in the book, Brian realizes that self-pity will not make surviving in the wilderness any easier. So what I do here is I ask myself, are they addressing the prompt by restating the question with the answer? And they are. So I just highlight it, and I'm going to highlight it green just so I know that that is there, that's present. Then I'm going to go to my next sentence. So my next sentence should be my RDF. And my RDF will tell me how or why Brian realizes that self-pity will not make surviving in the wilderness any easier. So it says Brian was crying and crying, but he eventually realized that that was useless. Okay, so that was useless. So maybe some minor changes could be made on the sentence structure, but that's not what I'm grading for right now. I'm just looking for an RDF that tells me how or why the topic sentence is true. Well, Brian realizes that that self-pity doesn't work, and one of the reasons is that it's useless, and that's what this person wrote. They wrote that it was useless. So then I come down here, and I highlight it yellow. Now I should be getting to the evidence. So it says on page 77, it states, quote, later, he looked back on this time of crying in the corner of the dark cave and thought of it as when he learned the most important rule of survival, which was that feeling sorry for yourself didn't work. So that's a good piece of evidence. As long as the explanation connects to it, this person is on the verge of getting 100. Brian knew that he needed to do more than just have self-pity on himself, which also helped him grow up some and be smarter. It may have taken some tears for him to realize it, but Brian eventually learned that the important lesson about not having self-pity, Brian eventually learned that the important lesson about not having self-pity to make surviving in the wilderness easier. So there's some clarity issues here, but I know what the person's trying to say. They're saying that they're using this quote, and they're explaining that yes, he cried, but he eventually reflected on it and he realized crying is not going to change the situation. So I'm not going to count against them on mechanics just yet. So everything seems to be there. So this would be 100. Now, after I highlight the different pieces, I go back and I give you some suggestions to clarify it. So like up here, it says, in the book, Brian realizes that self-pity will not make surviving in the wilderness easier. All right. I'm going to get rid of in the book because I think it would just sound better if it says Brian realizes that self-pity will not make surviving in the wilderness any easier. We know it's in the book, so you don't have to say that part. Brian was crying and crying, but he eventually realized that it was useless. And I'm going to say, just for clarity, I'm going to say, after crying until he could cry no longer, Brian, and then I'm going to say Brian eventually realized that feeling sorry for himself was useless. So instead of saying that was useless, I'm going to be more specific on what that is. And then on page 77, it says, later he looked back on this time. That's just a direct quote. We haven't mentioned Hatchett, so you could clarify and say on page 77 of Hatchett, it states, and then at the very bottom, the explanation. Brian knew that he needed to do more than just have self-pity on himself, which also helped him grow up some and be smarter. So Brian knew that self-pity didn't work. Now, it almost looks like the person saying that self-pity made him grow smarter and helped him to grow up. I'm going to say Brian, I'm going to just get rid of this entire sentence. It may have taken some tears for him to realize it, but Brian eventually learned the important lesson about not having self-pity to make surviving in the wilderness easier. So for clarity, my explanation is going to say, it may have taken some tears for him to realize it, but Brian eventually learned the important lesson that so basically self-pity learned the important lesson that self-pity doesn't change anything. And I might even add another explanation to clarify it. Doesn't change anything and probably only makes a situation worse. So now it reads as this. Brian realizes that self-pity will not make surviving in the wilderness any easier. After crying until he could cry no longer, Brian eventually realized that feeling sorry for himself was useless. On page 77 of Hatchet it states, later he looked back on this time of crying in the corner of the dark cave and thought of it as when he learned the most important rule of survival, which was that feeling sorry for yourself didn't work. It may have taken some tears for him to realize it, but Brian eventually learned the important lesson that self-pity doesn't change anything and probably only makes the situation worse. And now I feel like adding one more thing. In the future, Brian knows to follow Mr. Perpitch's and I think we need to distinguish that Mr. Perpitch is the English teacher. Follow his English teacher's teacher, Mr. Perpitch's advice that to stay positive. Okay, and that's how I grade. So to recap, all I'm doing this time is I'm looking for the topic sentence. I highlight it green. Then I look for the RDF, which is this a reason, detail, or fact to support the topic sentence? Does it tell me how or why the topic sentence is true? And then I go to the evidence and the explanation. So I'm looking for, does my evidence and explanation tell me how or why my RDF is true? Does it support my RDF? And then once I've highlighted all the different pieces, I go back in and make some suggestions so that it sounds more clear. You'll see at the bottom of this a little note where I've given you some pointers. Some of you I wrote a brief little response about your essay, and it's usually going to be blue, and it's of a special font I use. It's about size 14. So be sure to look at yours and remember this lesson.